All right. Hey, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm seeing the attendees trickling in. Happy to have you all join us. My name is Amanda Forys. I am the managing partner of Magnolia Market Access. And thank you for joining us today with our Navigating Market Access with Magnolia Webinar Series. We have this every third Thursday of the month at 12 o'clock Eastern. And the goal is to cover interesting topics in all of market access, real world evidence, health economics, and to make this interactive. So we're going to be chatting with you, and you're welcome to send us questions along the way that we can try to answer as well. We're thrilled today to have a great panel to discuss the IRA, and I'm going to turn it over to Tracy Baroni Allmon, our Vice President of Market Access and Health Policy.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome everybody. We want to take a minute to have the panelists introduce themselves so you know who's going to be speaking with you today, and then we will jump right into the agenda. Amanda already introduced me, and I'm happy to be here, and we can move on to the other panelists. Samantha?
Sure. Hi, I'm happy to be here too. Delighted to be part of this great panel today. My name's Samantha Jouin, as you can see here. I'm a consultant. I worked at a pharma company on IRA drug price negotiation in the first round in IPA 2026. And now I am a consultant on my own at WayForward Advisory, helping clients with IRA readiness.
Chris?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Very happy to be here. Partner at Latham and Watkins. My only important statement is whatever I'm saying here today is just my own personal views, not the view of the firm, not the view of our many clients. So whatever you hear from me today is just my own personal story. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. Thank you both. Herman, are you with us?
Yeah, I am. Herman Chen, Senior VP of Market Access and Analytics at Magnolia. I'll be sharing some Part D formulary data later in the presentation. So thanks everyone for being here with us today.
All right. Thank you all. Quickly, we are going to go in chronological order, talk a little bit about what happened at the end of 2024 in case during the break and the first part of the year, which has been really busy, you forget what has happened. What 2025 looks like, some of what we know, some of what we're hearing, and some of what will be a little bit of a anticipatory. And then for 26 and 27, we know that the IPAY will take effect in 26. What does that look like? How can we ensure that patients continue to have access? And then finally, we will look at the crystal ball and get our thoughts from each panelist of what they think the future holds. And so when we think about, whoops, too many clicks. When we think about what has happened just a month ago, less than a month ago in many cases, we got the release from CMS about the process and outcome of the negotiations. Now, that didn't have to be released until March, and yet it was released. And some of the important non-substantive things, I would call them, that we learned are that 5 out of 10 manufacturers for the drugs, they did agree to a negotiated price, but for 5 of the drugs, CMS had to send a final offer letter. And so I do think that's important. And I think it's also something that CMS wanted to make sure that people understood, is that perhaps you could interpret it that for 5 of the 10 drugs, there was a willing and reasonable negotiation. Despite the range of the discounts, some being tremendously high, there were reports in the news outlets saying prices aren't too bad. It's still way more expensive here, even under these prices, than it is in Sweden. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Samantha, and, as you being the only person on the panel who's actually lived through the negotiation process, I'm interested in your opinion generally of the documents released by CMS describing the processes. I personally found them not to be tremendously transparent or helpful, but you're certainly better positioned than I am to tell us how this information could be valuable to the next round of negotiated drugs.
Sure, Tracy. Yeah, happy to jump in on this. I will acknowledge where you said, there's not a lot of transparency. And I think the big frustration for people looking at these right up front is there's no why. It doesn't say why they arrived at a certain price for each of the drugs, right? It doesn't say how they weighted the factors. They talk about a holistic approach, which is frustrating, right? There's not, the sort of the golden key there of why each price was what it was. However, I was surprised by how much was in there, right? They had to publish a rationale. That's a lot more than a rationale. They published the full manufacturer submissions. Yes, they're heavily redacted, especially the manufacturer data part. But there's also a lot of information in there. There's also the agendas for each of the negotiation meeting. I really think there's some helpful information in there if you read the tea leaves. For example, the therapeutic alternatives that were put forward by some manufacturers are there in some cases. For some, you can see the therapeutic alternatives that the manufacturers were arguing against. You can see how they said their drug was a therapeutic advancement in certain cases. CMS itself lists in their upfront rationale, if you want to call it that, the therapeutic alternatives that it considered for each negotiated drug. So this really could give future companies in this coming cycle and future cycles, an idea of how CMS could consider therapeutic alternatives, right? So that helps them think about their value story and even their evidence they could be generating if they're, a few years out. CMS did put in some pretty guarded language about therapeutic alternative, right? That it's only for IR purposes, it's not for clinical decision making, but still helpful for companies to even understand that this is how CMS is looking at it. It's a non-traditional way of looking at an alternative. I would also say the negotiation meeting agendas give helpful insight into the focus areas for negotiation. Those agendas vary from drug to drug. It's not a set thing, right? You can see sometimes the topics are around the therapeutic alternatives, sometimes the company selected therapeutic alternatives, sometimes around how CMS selected them, and even into CMS's methodology. There's this footnote there that says that the agendas are inclusive of topics proposed by the manufacturers. So it varied, but you can see also what the manufacturers were trying to, if you will, push as the focus topics in that way, which I think is interesting. That really points to the hot button issues, again, for things for future manufacturers in this to think about. There are no slides or documents from the actual negotiation meetings. Although the guidelines did allow that. So were there none, or did they just choose not to include that? We don't really know, right? You can also see who attended the meetings from CMS and in many cases from the manufacturers. That's helpful for companies looking forward because they can understand the types of functions and roles that need to be involved from their side. You can see the arguments for comparative effectiveness in specific populations that were made. You can even see comments that actually in all the cases that the public and advocacy groups submitted. And you can also see that CMS prioritized direct comparative evidence they had versus, from head-to-head RCTs. So there's a lot in there. That's just a little bit. I could go on, but I think if you take the time to really dig in, there are some definite points there that could help future companies.
Thank you, Samantha. Clearly, there's much more there than I was able to pull out during my one go through. Chris, right around the time this list was released, the National Community Pharmacists Association came out and indicated that many or a significant number of their members who are independent community pharmacists would not be able to stock drugs that have MFPs potentially because of the difference between the reimbursement amount and what they pay to acquire, the time to get the discount back from manufacturers. And then following that, the proposed rule came out talking about the Medicare transaction facilitator. And I'm wondering if you think the MTF is the answer and how this goes.
Yeah, happy to comment on that. Let me maybe say a couple of things about what was released here in the information. So the Biden administration published these MFP explanations without any fanfare in December. So there was no press release, there was no statement. And I think the trade press didn't pick up on it until maybe last week. I found this was surprising because I would have expected them to use this as another opportunity to make a big splash for IRA, but they didn't. They just sort of like put that on the website. That website where this was posted is actually very important. The other thing they posted more recently, or I guess slightly before these explanations, is details about how the MFP breaks down. Because when the MFPs were first published, it kind of said like MFP for a 90-day supply, whatever it was. They've since then published more detailed information, how they're breaking the MFP down to a per unit price. So it definitely makes sense to monitor that website and take a look at it. I'll disagree a little bit with an earlier comment about how these discounts are not all outrageous. I mean, I think if we're talking 40% discount, that's the extreme discount. I also disagree that this is a true negotiation. This is really not a negotiation. We're being forced to the table and we can't walk away from it. Nevertheless, to your other question, what is the benefit here for patients really, right? If it turns out that the way that the distribution system works and the way that this MTF is going to work, if it ends up making it difficult for these drugs to make it to the pharmacy, which I think we don't know that yet. It's early days still. We'll have to see how that really plays out. But it raises this bigger question in the IRA: is this really to the benefit of patients? And I think that's a big argument that's ongoing. In terms of the MTF, my comment here would be, there are a bunch of other federal programs where manufacturers commit to a ceiling price. 340B is obviously one of them. There's the federal ceiling price. And those programs have been in operation for many years. When they were established and enacted, the manufacturers were given this obligation, they signed on and they agreed to this obligation. But how that ceiling price is effectuated was left up to industry and was left up to the business. So as you know, there are different ways in which the 340B ceiling price can be effectuated, so on and so forth. What's really a sea change here with the IRA max fair price is not only is the law having manufacturers agree to a ceiling price, CMS in this guidance, which actually is finalized, it's not just proposed, the finalized 2026 MFP IRA guidance sets forth very detailed procedures for how this max fair price has to be effectuated. And you mentioned the Medicare transaction facilitator. So CMS is purporting to set up a data spider here, which will either be run by the government or by a contracted organization or company. And this MTF data spider will handle the data exchange between the dispensing pharmacy, between the manufacturer. And then optionally, you can even, as a manufacturer, sign on with the MTF to also handle the cash. So we are entering a world here purportedly where not only are we dealing with government price controls on pharmaceuticals, which is what this really is, we're having CMS show up in our business. I mean, right in the middle, right there. And so just comparing how this implementation is being suggested here as it compares to these other long-standing federal programs that involve a ceiling price, if it gets executed the way that final guidance purports to do it, I think this would be a major change that we would see here in how the business operates. I'll make one final point, jumping back to the explanation of the max fair prices. One trend here, as Samantha mentioned, is this looking at a whole therapeutic class and moving away from this notion of we have one drug with one benefit, let's reimburse for that drug based on its benefit, to now kind of say, well, we'll just look at a whole group. Why look at one drug at a time? Let's look at a whole group. And that's something that's been bandied around for a while. MedPAC had in some recommendations earlier. And I think we're seeing that this is maybe something that is not going to go away very quickly. And I think it's a detriment to innovation because, yeah, you might be part of the therapeutic class, but why did you get your drug approved? Because obviously there's a patient benefit, there's a difference in the method of action, so on and so forth. And if we are moving towards a world where reimbursement is set based on a whole therapeutic class, and then we have the government sort of wishy-washy saying, well, for this purpose, just for negotiation, we're going to define the class really broadly. Oh, but then when it comes for clinical use, ignore what we're saying because obviously they're not interchangeable, right? That is not a good direction I think we're heading in.
Thanks, Chris. I think, there's already a template out there for that, right? ICER. And if it looks like it's feasible, why not jump on that bandwagon, right? And I would, of course, agree with you that that's probably not a solution that takes us any closer to the value price that is something that we certainly all strive for, just coming from different directions, obviously. So this is the iPay 27 list. Announced just last week, which sometimes seems like a lifetime ago. And the lucky winners are, as you can see, 3 within endocrine and metabolic disorders, 4 oncology therapies, 3 pulmonary respiratory, 2 gastroenterology, 2 neurology, and 1 dermatology. Total spend for these drugs is about $40.7 billion. Chris, I'm wondering whether you think there are any reasonable legal challenges likely to play out this list. Specifically, I think that CMS has used their discretion around identifying is a generic available and what is the timing of that generic, both with Stelara in IPay 26 and then with at least one drug for IPay 26 where a limited distribution agreement was determined to be generics available, and similarly for at least one drug, that same logic in IPay 27. And in addition to the discretion around generic availability and your negotiability of the drug based on that, also the qualified single source drugs. There's press out today indicating that some people are saying there's actually 18 different drugs on the 15 drug list, which you could certainly interpret it that way. What are your thoughts on CMS and how they're implementing and using their discretion?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack on this one. We could talk about just this topic for the entire time, which I promise I won't do that. So let's maybe start with setting the stage a little bit, right? So the IRA gave us a policy from the lawmakers. Congress is the lawmaker. We got to deal with that. That's what they gave us, right? But the law says 15 drugs. If you count the names on this list over here, I think we can actually get to 19. I think there are 19 different drug names on this list. So how is this possible that Congress said 15 and CMS ends up giving us, 19, right? So the way we get there is that the definition of what is a qualifying single source drug, QSSD, the key defined term, is not particularly clear in the statute. And CMS used that as an opening when they came out with their guidance to define QSSD in a very, very broad fashion. And that decision that CMS made in the initial guidance and and also in the final guidance, and they maintain that approach for 2026, that allows CMS to squeeze multiple drugs into these slots. So we have 15 slots, but various drugs are bunking up together to squeeze into one slot, getting us to a number that's greater than, I would argue, what Congress intended. What is the status of this list is another interesting question. There was trade press discussion yesterday, I think today. This was published by the Biden administration on their last evening in town. And the deadline for publication of this isn't until February 1st. So they kind of jumped the gun and published this earlier than they had to. And there's chatter to kind of contemplate, could the Trump administration reverse some of this? Could they tweak some of this? What might be pathways for that? So I think we're just in a world right now where we need to check the news kind of every day and see what evolves, if anything, what possibly could happen. You mentioned the legal challenges. I'm sure we'll talk about those a little bit more later on. But yes, this use of CMS's discretion to really expand, and this is just one example where CMS expanded sort of the scope and the statute is kind of like this, and then CMS kind of went like that, right, and broadened the scope. The QSD definition is just one of those parameters where CMS set the dials extremely toward one direction. So yes, I mean, these are all issues that will be on the table in litigation, in advocacy, 100%.
Thank you. Samantha, when we talked earlier, you correctly noted, although the companies aren't up here, that many of the companies that are going to be looking at IPay 27 as an upcoming activity were also involved in the maiden voyage for the initial drug list. How should companies new to negotiations be thinking about the upcoming negotiations, and what can even experienced companies learn from their first round, even if the drugs are in different classes, different competitive situations than they were the first round?
That's a really good question, Tracy. I think both experienced and new companies to this cycle can learn from what's in the published rationales, as I mentioned, especially around how to think about therapeutic alternatives and be ready for that. For those that have been through this last year, I'm sure they have learnings from the interactions. They were in the room where it happens, as you say, that they can apply to this cycle. But seeing the list of CMS attendees for each meeting last year for the different drugs should be helpful for all the companies so they understand the possible level of expertise in the different therapeutic areas that may or may not have been involved. They can, understand the drug-specific know-how these people might have. For the new companies, one thing that comes out of those rationales, whether you read through them or not, is the sheer volume, right? there's a lot there. There's a lot of work for the manufacturer. It involves many different functions, and I hope that the manufacturers who, were thinking they might be selected were already looking at those publications, because it really gives you an idea of how much effort, cross-functional, strategic effort needs to be put into this. There's another group I want to mention here, companies who aren't selected, that are competitors to these drugs. Beyond preparing for what it will mean to have an MFP price to compete against, they should also think about how and if they want to put their foot forward in this cycle. Like, do they want to make public comment, or think about how advocacy groups are saying, what advocacy groups may be saying about the class? You can see in the published rationales that there were times when competitors submitted a public comment. So I think that's all really important things for, some things for all companies, and some things more specific to the new companies. But I really do think in the rationales, looking across the different classes of drugs that were, documented, there's a lot to learn. And the next slide, we'll cover more how specifics of how companies should be planning.
Yep, absolutely. So thank you for that. And we would love for you to walk through this on how companies should be thinking and what you need to do to be successful.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this idea of 5 compass points is really important for companies. There's a lot here. As I said, it's voluminous, right? A lot of work, but I think if you think about these key areas, that will really help companies think about how they should best prepare. So the first one on the left there is therapeutic alternatives. I've already talked about this a lot, but it's a key point for the companies. What's the therapeutic alternative that's most likely, and what do you want it to be? What's the one that's most favorable to you, and how can you, as a company, prepare a strong argument to back what you want your therapeutic alternative to be? What evidence do you have? What evidence can a company be generating? What will CMS likely take as a therapeutic alternative, especially, now they have that definition that they sort of backed away from what it might mean clinically. What will they use, and how will you try to refute that as a company, right? So there's a lot of strategic thinking there. Probably the first step before getting into any of the mess of the paperwork and documentation is really thinking about the therapeutic alternative. And again, not just this year, but the companies in the future years, right? Because that's going to help them think about the next step here, which is evidence diversity, right? It's great to have evidence. It's good to have RCTs. It's good to have evidence against a therapeutic alternative, but make sure that evidence is in Medicare populations, right? Does the company who thinks they're going to be selected or selected this year, do they have that evidence? Do they have that evidence in all of the indications that they need it in? If they can't answer yes, then a company should be thinking about generating that evidence, now, especially the ones in future cycles. So therapeutic alternative evidence, really important. Now we get into more of the tactical stuff in the middle here, human resources planning. So has your organization implemented the right cross-functional team for optimized effort from submission through negotiation? As I've said, these are hefty dossiers, and there's a lot of work involving a lot of people from many different functions. Companies should think about having a team ready or planning for that team. They need to make sure that key people are staying up to date on Medicare drug price negotiation guidance, on the published rationales, which we just talked about at length. So they'll be ready when it's the company's turn, whether it's this cycle or future cycles, right? It's not something you can start planning for last minute. Companies should be thinking about who is actually preparing the submission, who's developing and approving the strategy, the therapeutic alternatives, for instance, a key part of the strategy. Who has final say on the actual write-ups, what's being submitted, which roles and who to include in the negotiation team. Again, there's some clues there in what was published, but really think about who that, it might not be a traditional team that you would be sending to a payer. So part of that also is who are the people who can get your points across the best, and who can best on the fly answer questions from CMS. There's a lot of thinking from a human resources planning, and I think companies may be going about this differently as far as, a different team each year. I know it's only year 2, depending on the drug, or a centralized team, but really need to think about institutionalizing that know-how. On the next piece, this is end-to-end strategic and tactical alignment. So this kind of dovetails into what I was talking about on the people side, but do companies have a clear roadmap to get from the selection all the way through this long process that leads to the actual publication? There's many steps along the way. It's not just a submission and you send it in, you have some meetings, right? Once the submission is in, companies should be thinking about advocacy and the public comment period, Then before they're going to get the MFP offer, they're going to get the MFP ceiling, which will help them think about negotiation scenarios. They need to be ready for that as a step. Then there's the actual negotiation and who's going to prepare for each round and who's going to refine the strategy and the talking points. And then when you actually get to MFP publication, how are companies thinking about the organizational readiness for when that number hits the press? So it's a long roadmap. It's not, and it's continuous. It's not a stop and start. And then finally, I've alluded to this, but the ecosystem is important. And you need to think about other stakeholders who could impact the process, such as advocacy groups, industry groups. And what about all those on the outside, the payers, et cetera, who are pushing to find out what's going on, right? How are you going to handle those questions? How are companies planning for their interactions with these stakeholders? I think is something important to consider as part of the whole end-to-end process. So there's a lot there, but those are some key areas I think companies really need to, put on the front burner.
Thank you very much for that detailed explanation. And so if we look a little bit into what we understood Part D changes to be, we knew that they would be significant. We knew that there would be cost shifts. Several months ago, the national average bid amount was not released by CMS because it was so much higher than it had been in previous years, which would have resulted in a likely extremely high premium increase, which was not actually permitted under the IRA. And so instead, CMS created the premium stabilization demonstration. And for 2025, over 50% of Medicare enrollees are in MAPDs and Medicare Advantage plans. And the vast majority who are in the Part D plans, the PDPs, are actually in PDPs that are participating within the demonstration project. So with that background, we're going to jump into Herman's data slides and have him walk us through what he sees within the 2025 formulary files.
Thanks, Tracy. So we are going to spend the next few minutes going over some data, specifically Part D formulary data. As some of you may be aware, CMS publishes these Part D formulary files every month for free, so the public can go and pull it down, from their website and get a snapshot of what Part D coverage looks like right now today, and also track historical trends over time as well. In regards to the types of plans that are in the data, we've got special need plans, Medicare, Medicaid dual eligible plans, standalone prescription drug plans or PDPs, and Medicare Advantage prescription drug plans, also referred to as MAPD plans. We are going to focus on PDPs and MAPD plans and how they're covering the first 10 drugs that were selected for Medicare price negotiation, which are all Part D's in dog treatments. Before we jump into that, shown here is just some of the information that CMS released back in October when they first made the Medicare landscape files available for plan year 2025. You can see the number of MAPD plans dropped slightly, but there was a steep decline in the number of PDP plans going from 709 to 464, which is really keeping with the recent trend the past few years, right? As the PDP market continues to contract for several reasons. But with all that said, right, CMS says that beneficiaries still have ample low-cost choices across all Part D plans when you account for PDPs and MAPD plans together. And lastly here, the average Part D premiums are going down in 2025. Premium stabilization and the voluntary demonstration set up some guardrails like Tracy just mentioned. And lastly, the max Part D deductible increased under the standard benefit like it does every year. Next slide. All right, so our first analysis here is at the plan level. So we're not looking at the 10 negotiated drugs just yet. What we're showing here is in 2024, a 5-tier formulary was the most commonly used formulary across PDPs and MAPDs. And it's even more prevalent today, shown on the chart on the left there, going up from about 3 out of 4 plans to over 4 out of 5 plans in 2025. When we peel back a layer, we see that the 5 tiers that nearly all plans are using are the generic tier, generic, preferred brand, non-preferred drug, and specialty tier. So that's the structure that's most popular among plans in both 2024 and today in 2025. Now, if the percent of plans using a 5-tier formulary increased, then what decreased, right? That would be the plans using a 6-tier formulary, which dropped about the same percentage as the increase in 5-tier formularies. When we look closer at that data, we see that the tier that's being removed is entirely what we're calling an other drug. An other drug tier, right? It's literally a tier called other drug, or some other examples are vaccine tier, a supplemental drug tier, a diabetic drug tier, or a non-Medicare over-the-counter drug tier. For 6-tier formularies, right, we see a modest number of plans using a 6-tier formulary, 22 and 16% across years. Among these plans, 93% of these plans are using the same tiers in both years. It's actually the same 5 tiers that I just listed out for the 5-tier formularies, but with an added other tier. So it's not like plans are splitting out the specialty tier into a preferred and non-preferred specialty tier. The 6th tier is usually just one of the other tiers. About the 7-tier formularies, very little use of them in 2024 and 2025. And the last thing I'll point out here is this middle chart here. All PDPs in 2025 have moved using a 5-tier formulary, up 80% from 2024. Next slide. Okay, out of all the formulary areas that we'll look at today, the largest change, hands down, is the type of cost share that plans are using in 2025. But cost share is very much tied to formulary tier. Directionally, the higher the tier, the higher the cost share. Now, in the previous slide, we just established that plans are not changing their formulary structure in 2025. They're all pretty much using the same 5 or 6 tiers this year that they were using last year. However, we're seeing significant changes in the mix of plans using copay or coinsurance. So if tiers aren't changing, but the cost share type is, what that means is that within a given tier, plans are flipping between copay and coinsurance. Specifically in the data, what we're seeing is in 2025, there's a change from copay to coinsurance and a shift in the cost burden from plans over to patients. And that's what's illustrated here in these charts here, right? The dotted lines represent a preferred brand tier, and the solid lines represent a non-preferred drug tier. Blue is copay and red is coinsurance. Now, I'll save you the time and trouble of trying to match all those up in the charts and just kind of point your focus to the red lines, which are coinsurance. All have a positive slope, meaning the percent of plans using coinsurance have increased in 2025 in both the preferred and non-preferred drug tiers. More than a twofold, right? Going from 2024 to 2025. And cost share is binary, right? Meaning that it's either going to be copay or coinsurance. And so when one side goes up, the other side goes down, which is the dynamic that we're seeing here when it comes to cost share types in 2025. Next slide. All right, now we jump into the 10 IP 2026 drugs. As the name applies, right, the negotiated prices don't go into effect until year 2026. But we wanted to know if plans have already started to change access for the 10 MFP drugs this year. If not, are they going to perhaps slow roll changes throughout the year? We can't necessarily answer that second question, but we can start answering the first question about what coverage looks like as of today. Overall, on the left chart, we're seeing plans cover no less than 7 of the 10 MFP drugs in both 2024 and 2025, with over 90% of plans covering 9 or all 10 drugs. There's actually about a 20% increase in plans covering 9 of the drugs, up from 33% to 54% in 2025. But it's not a situation of plans going from covering 8 to 9 drugs and adding a drug. It's mostly plans going from covering all 10 drugs down to 9 and dropping 1 drug. We'll see a little more of that in the next slide. But when you see and look at PDPs in the middle chart, you see there's a big shift in those plans covering from 10 to 9 drugs between the 2 years. I'll just say kind of last point here, like covering 9 out of 10 drugs certainly isn't horrendous. But by the time we get to 2026, the mandate says that all plans have to put all 10 MFP drugs on formulary. So we should only see one color in the bars signaling all 10 drugs are being covered, once we get to 2026. Next slide. This here shows Part D coverage similar as the previous slide, except we've separated the data out by drug. Coverage remained largely consistent for most MFP drugs. As the previous slide alluded to, we can see more clearly here that most plans, all plans, right, are covering many of the 10 MFP drugs in both years. The exception is Enbrel, second drug from the left, and Novolog Fiasp, which is in that insulin space, that can't charge more than $35 for a 1 month supply under the IRA. Across years, it looks like plans are picking on Enbrel, which has about 15% fewer plans overall covering it in 2025. Next slide. So for plans that are covering the 10 drugs in both years, we took a look at which tiers plans are putting them on. Lots of dark blue here, right, which is the preferred brand tier, and some specialty tier in orange stands out too. Some plans put Forxiga on the non-preferred drug tier, which is in light blue, but not all that much, relatively speaking. When we look across years, we're not seeing really any significant movement to a different tier for any drug. So not really any changes in regard to formulary positioning. And that was the same in both PDP and MAPD plans when we looked at those. Next tier, next slide. Utilization management, or again, by 2026, plans have to cover all 10 drugs, but the mandate is largely silent beyond that about what plans can and can't do to manage access for the negotiated drugs. Tier position and are some areas that plans can fiddle around in and things to keep an eye on. But as of right now, prior authorization is step therapy. Not a whole lot of changes here. Basically, if a plan did not have a PA or ST requirement for one of the 10 drugs in 2024, then they didn't have one in 2025 either. Conversely, if the plan did have a PA or ST requirement on one of the 10 drugs in 2024, they did have one in 2025 too. So that's really the main takeaway at this moment. Shown here on this slide are just the drugs that have a PA or step therapy restriction in either year. When we dig down into looking at the differences between PDP and MAPD, similar results there, except that on average, there were a higher percentage of PDPs that required step therapy compared to MAPD plans. Next slide. So we've touched a little bit on cost share type already and big changes in that area in 2025. This year shows copay versus coinsurance for each drug as a percentage of Part D enrollment. The trend here is that in all of the 2025 bars, the orange coinsurance segment is larger than the orange coinsurance segment in the 2024 bars if they're not already at 100% coinsurance like they are for Enbrel, Imbruvica, and Stelara, again, which just illustrates plans are shifting from copay to coinsurance. When we compare PDPs and MAPDs, we see a higher percentage of PDPs using coinsurance than MAPD plans. So there's a difference there when you drill down to that level. Next slide. So these last couple of slides we're gonna wrap up are just more data on cost share. These here are enrollment weighted copay amount averages across plans for each drug. Relatively stable across years and no big $20 jumps or anything like that. But some up, some down by a little bit, with Januvia and Jardiance in the middle there having the largest increase of about $7 each on average. I will point out that across all plans, we found that the median copay in 2024 that was changed to coinsurance in 2025 was $47 for each drug. I'm going to come back to that number in a second, but on the current coinsurance slide on the next slide, similarly, somewhat consistent year to year in average coinsurance for the 10 drugs with a 2 to 3% change at most in either direction. So for the plans that moved from copay to coinsurance, the median coinsurance for each drug was about 25%. So these patients are going from a $47 copay to a 25% coinsurance. Now we know there's a $2,000 out-of-pocket cap starting this year, but it's still quite a jump on a per prescription basis, right, when patients are underneath the cap. So just to summarize the Part D formulary data, cost sharing is where we're seeing the biggest changes at. Not a whole lot of differences right away in early 2025 when it comes to coverage, tier placement, or requirements, but certainly all things to keep an eye on as we move towards 2026. With that, I will turn it back over to Tracy.
All right. Thank you, Herman. So it is interesting to think about the higher NAMBA, the expectation of significantly higher premiums, and yet the one significant change we see is a shift from copay to coinsurance, which certainly can make a difference. But yet there was no significant difference in removing any of at least the selected drugs from the formulary. So not sure what we take from that unless we can get inside of a PDP meeting and try to understand it better from their perspective.
Can I pause for a couple questions that have come in?
That's a great idea. Thanks, Amanda.
Great. Now, this always happens when we show data, right? Everyone wants
Yep.
to get into it. So great. There was a question around the 4 drugs that qualified for the small biotech exemption for 2027. Do we have any insights into those?
Publicly
From a data
disclosed.
perspective, unfortunately, we don't. Not enough formulary data.
We haven't
Besides
pulled
what,
that
yeah,
yet.
besides what we're showing, yeah, on the slides here.
Yeah, we definitely could pull that. We just didn't, yeah, we didn't pull that for this, but it would be very similar look that we could do. And then the second question is, as we get into 2025 and the benefit redesign, do you expect Part D plans to change processes around formulary exception prior auths? As a home infusion pharmacy provider, many of the fusion drugs we provide are in the home and are accessible via formulary exception prior auths. I can take this one unless somebody has an insight that they would want to throw in.
Go for it.
Okay, the processes could potentially change. I think we're seeing a lot of new things come in terms of AI and the way that formulary exceptions and even just general prior auths are being submitted. So I do think that we will see some more sophistication in the way that those processes are set up, the length of time it takes to get them approved. So I would definitely say, regardless of home infusion or any other product, I do think that's an area that will get more increasingly complex and challenging for providers as they're trying to get drugs exempted for a patient or approved for a patient when there's an exemption. Okay, those are the only 2 I had so far. I'll let y'all carry on.
Great. So this slide just depicts what the standard benefit design looks like for coverage year 2026 for both the non-selected drugs and the selected MFP drugs. Medicare patients who hit the $2,000 out-of-pocket maximum could see significant savings, according to a recent report from AARP. And of the 1 million Medicare enrollees who will reach that cap, about 94% are expected to save about $2,400, and so cutting their costs by over half. Meanwhile, nearly 19 million Part D enrollees will have an estimated $7.4 billion in annual out-of-pocket costs saved once the Part D coverage-related provisions are fully implemented in 2025. Chris, as someone who works in this space significantly, what are the main concerns around how CMS has implemented the law, and what has the impact been?
Yeah, I guess we have to first acknowledge that this Part D benefit redesign is probably what's most directly going to impact patients. And of course, the plan was to do that in a positive fashion. And we've heard how there needed to be this, special whatever demonstration to support the premiums not going too high. But nevertheless, I mean, we can see on this slide that the patient is doing much better under the redesign than before. The key takeaway for manufacturers is that sort of like, turquoise manufacturer color, where during initial coverage, the manufacturer has to give a 10% discount on Part D prescriptions. And then during catastrophic phase, it's 20%. And if you think back how that compares to the coverage gap discount program that this replaces, in that program, we used to give 70% in the coverage gap, but that was just a certain small window that the patient would exit, right? So now we have patients that are going to stay in catastrophic for the rest of the year. So financially, this is a much greater discount burden on manufacturers than under the pre-existing, coverage gap discount program that all this replaces. Interesting implication here is this phase-in notion. So the IRA gave a bit of a break to certain manufacturers. And if the manufacturer qualifies for that, then the 10 and 20% don't kick in right away in 2025, but they kind of go up over a 7, 8, 9 year period until you hit the full 10 and 20% later on. What the IRA left out is to address where that essentially shortfall would come from. Because if you look at this bar here for initial coverage or catastrophic coverage that ends up, adding up to 100%, if, let's say, in the initial phase, the manufacturer only has to give a 1% discount, we are missing 9%, right, to get to 100.
Yeah.
So IRA didn't say where that money was going to come from. CMS in its wisdom said, well, it's going to come from the plans. And so the question really for manufacturers is, okay, so you're happy because there are two different phase-ins. One is the more attractive. But so let's say you got the phase-in, you're happy about that. But now you're talking to the plans about coverage for your drug, and the plan says, well, you know what? I'm now going to show already this redesign is giving me more burdens, which I'm going to try to push back onto you, manufacturer. But now I've gotten even this extra more of a burden for your drugs because you got this stupid phase in. I'm going to put that back on you as well, right? So it was interesting to see for the negotiations for 2025. It'll be interesting to see for next year. Those manufacturers that hope to have a benefit from the phase in, how much of that was really taken away by the plans then stepping up and asking for some more help. The phase-in information, by the way, is public, so you can look up who has the phase-in. You can look up which particular drugs have the phase-in. I think this question about the small biotech exception, that kind of relates to the negotiation process, and that I think is not public. So I think we don't know what those companies are based on CMS statements.
Thanks, Chris. Samantha, looking at the patient maximum out-of-pocket and the limited requirements to really advertise the possibility of the Medicare prescription payment plan for patients for whom it would be appropriate, what should manufacturers be focused on to ensure access?
I think education, getting the word out, right? They need to focus on educating patients, advocacy groups, even HCPs on the new out-of-pocket maximum and on the Medicare prescription payment plan, right? The plan where you pay by month and don't have a lot out of pocket up front. I think the plans that we all saw did the strict minimum in publicizing this. Just a personal anecdote. I was trying to help my mother sign up for her plan and see if I could find it. I couldn't find. I mean, I had to do a massive search of the plan's website to find it. It wasn't advertised anywhere, very obviously. So if companies aren't already doing it, if they're not already there, they really should be thinking about getting the word out. And one thing to keep in mind is it's complicated to explain. So it's really important to simplify it to get that message across.
Absolutely. And so beyond the Part D plans and the MAPDs, we know that the IRA has resulted in at least 3 lawsuits that are in federal district court for awaiting decision. There's at least one new one, maybe a couple more. What does the disposition of those look like, Chris?
Yeah, so I mean, I can talk about this more generally. We represent Novartis in one of these pending or ongoing lawsuits. And, Teva just filed, I think, the most recent one last week or last couple of weeks. So what I can say about this at a high level is, let's get into a little bit of a legalese background here, right? So when the law was first enacted in 2022, nobody was immediately impacted, right? The law came out, but the implementation didn't happen until 2023, 2024, right? So if that's the situation you're in, and Congress has just passed the statute, if you want to challenge the statute, really what you're left challenging it on is constitutional issues, right? So if Congress passes a law that says you can no longer, it's outlawed to say the number 2025. If you say 2025, you go to jail. Well, that's illegal because free speech allows us to say that, right? So if a law like that were to be enacted, we don't have to wait for somebody to go to jail because they said 2025. You would immediately go to court and say, this is violating the Constitution, this has to stop. And that's what these initial lawsuits were basically saying. So if you look at the initial lawsuits, there's sort of like a list of constitutional claims. One that we can all understand is takings, the notion of a takings, right? If the government has to build a highway where your house is, they can't just kick you out of the house. They got to give you fair value for your house, and then they can build the highway. So they can take the house away from you, but it has to be done under due process for appropriate value. So some of these long, ongoing claims, just as one example, is this notion of a takings, right? The government is taking away our patents, essentially, our value in our drugs, by forcing us to sell at this cap price, and we're not getting justly compensated. And that's just one example. So these lawsuits that were initially filed all had these different constitutional law claims, where even before the law had been implemented and had changed someone's status, the law itself was challenged on the grounds that the law as passed, as written, was violating the Constitution. So those lawsuits are still ticking along. They didn't do so well at the district level. They go to the circuit level. So that's kind of ongoing. What we're going to see, and we're beginning to see that, is now that the law has been implemented, that max fair prices have been published, that things are actually happening to companies and to their drugs, the challenges are going to transition now from just this constitutional challenge to the as applied challenge, right? Where it's not just, I think this is not permissive, but now not permissible, but now we're going to the point where my asset has been damaged, my money has been taken, my rights have been infringed based on what the government is doing to me. So that's just going to change, the nature of the challenges. We're going from this more abstract, highfalutin constitutional law legal world into the actual world of, hey, CMS sent me a letter and they said they're going to take this from me, they're going to do this to me. I'm challenging those specific actions. To kind of round out this more legalese discussion here, how do things get challenged in court, right? So we've all heard about the Chevron deference coming off the table recently. Is that relevant here? Up to a point, right? So typically what happens is Congress passes a statute, the executive branch, CMS, issues regulations, and then if we don't like the regulation or we think it's overreaching, then we challenge the regulation. And that's where Chevron comes into play, right? How much deference does the agency get into making its regulations? The IRA is unusual in a couple of respects. So Congress saw fit to give the executive the power, the executive branch, CMS, HHS, the power to shift billions of dollars, not through regulation, right? Not through a proposed rule, final rule, comment period, but through guidance. So CMS basically can publish stuff on the website and say, this is how we're going to do it, right? And the IRA is okay with that for the first few years. So that's unusual. And this is why when we talk about the negotiation process, we're talking about guidance. It's not a regulation that CMS has promulgated, it's just guidance. The other quite odd feature in the IRA is the so-called jurisdictional stripping provision. So there's a section in the IRA that says certain actions by CMS are shielded from administrative or legal challenge. So Congress has really given CMS a lot of power to make decisions. And then Congress said to the stakeholders, to the world, yeah, so CMS can make this call and you cannot challenge it. So there are ways to get around that. There are ways to attack that. But this is what makes the IRA a little bit unusual, right? Normally we would see there's a statute, there's a reg, we challenge the reg if we think there's an issue with it. Here, the pathway is going to be a little bit different going forward.
Great, thank you. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to ask Samantha really quickly, under the Trump administration, do you foresee any changes to the DPNP selection criteria, or are you hearing anything about intervention, as we talked about earlier, into the IPay 27 drugs? And then we'll jump to crystal ball.
Yeah, the things I really wonder about on the Trump administration side would be the definition, and Chris alluded to this earlier, of qualifying single source drug, right? I mean, the companies have been pushing on that, and Republican lawmakers seem to have been open to those arguments. So I wonder if there could be change there, right? Narrowing some of the criteria. And I wonder also on the orphan drug, I think Chris could speak to the legal aspects of that too, but that's also been a point of contention for companies, a drug that has more than one orphan drug indication. So I wonder if there also could be a narrowing of definitions there, which would mean excluding more products.
Chris, do you have thoughts on orphan?
Yeah, just to briefly jump in on that. So we have to kind of distinguish between what the law actually requires, and to fix that would require congressional action, right? So it would require opening up the IRA again, revising statutory language, has to pass both houses, be signed by the president. It's like another law, right? This is another legal action by Congress. Whereas these other areas like qualifying a single source drug, QSSD, that is something that exists in CMS guidance that they've published. And if CMS can publish guidance one way, now under a different administration, they could be instructed to revise that guidance in another direction, right? So the hurdle to fixing orphan drug exclusion, and another discussion I've heard going on is this difference between NDA, BLA drugs, right? Where the NDA drugs get subject to negotiation earlier. How is that fair? Those are all things that would require congressional action. Things like the QSSD definition, right? Which drugs are actually eligible, the eligibility sort of framework, that is something CMS could change. They issued it as guidance. They could issue revised guidance. Some other topics there are also when is a generic deemed to be marketed, right? When does CMS
Yep.
reach satisfaction to say, oh yeah, there is market competition enough to keep a brand drug off the list, right? What is the standard for that? It's another area where CMS painted with a very broad brush, and that could theoretically be tweaked.
Absolutely. I think that's a big one right there, honestly. And so I'm going to ask each of you, starting with Herman, to give me a couple sentences on your crystal ball forecasts, and then I think we have a couple more questions in the chat.
Yeah, so not to say maybe crystal ball, right? But some questions that we've gotten before is like, what's going to be the ripple effect on commercial payers in general? So things like, are we going to see any cost shifting and higher prices for commercial payers to compensate for reduced Medicare revenue? Commercial payers might adopt more restrictive formularies or cost containment measures to account for potential price shifts. Are commercial insurers going to align their tiering and pricing structures, to take advantage of the cost reductions in Medicare? Cost sharing adjustments, generic and biosimilar uptake, and just kind of overall greater demand for transparency in the commercial drug pricing market. So those are some areas to look out for on the commercial front, either directly or indirectly caused by the IRA.
Thank you. Samantha, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would love to have the crystal ball into what we were just discussing with the new administration, right? I wouldn't be surprised if industry prevails in some of those areas as far as narrowing criteria. But I'd say another crystal ball topic for sure is what this industry, what the marketplace is going to look like in a few years when more and more drugs are MFP'd. I think from a company and industry perspective, on the commercial side, people will be thinking about what their drugs marketplace and possibilities pre MFP in the class and post, right? It'll be two different worlds, and basically to what Herman alluded to, spillover from the Medicare side into the commercial side. So I think that just the way we look at the dynamics of the products in the marketplace will change. Once something is MFP'd in that class, it's going to be a new world.
Absolutely. And Chris.
Yeah, so the election result came down and the clients were saying, so what do we think this means? And my answer was, well, let's see who they nominate, right? Once we know who's nominated, maybe that's helpful. Then we got the nominations. Now we're kind of like, well, all these nominees on any topic have said any number of things. So we still don't really know.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to try to second guess where Trump is going to go with things like the negotiation program. So we just said that there is quite a bit of discretion here for the executive, so they could definitely change things without congressional action, most likely. What are they going to do there? It's really hard to kind of know that in advance. So I would say the world we're in is, check the trade press, keep tabs on what's going on, but also let's not give up hope, right? When there is change, when there is, let's say, also a bit of chaos, it also opens the door for advocacy. So I think, speaking here for the pharma manufacturer stakeholders, the action items for us are really to tell our story, right? Let's be out there when we can, when we are offering awesome patient benefits, curative treatments, improvements in quality of life. That is a story that needs to be told. So whatever avenue we can have to broadcast those successes, we should definitely do that. We should advocate as much as we can when there are comment periods, even if it's just one of these lame Paperwork Reduction Act notices, and you think, well, what is that about? It is an opportunity to submit comments that have to be looked at. Take those opportunities. It is our chance to talk to the government stakeholders. And then thirdly, if all else fails, as industry has been doing, we got to step up and litigate. If our rights are being abrogated, if there's overreach on the side of the government, then the only remedy is to step up in court and do that. And I think that's a trend we've seen the last couple of years, where there's a lot more litigation in the drug pricing field than ever before. And that's just because that is the only final avenue that's available to us.
Amen on the advocacy and on the last step being ultimately litigation, unfortunately. Amanda, can you see, are there still a couple questions in the chat if people are able to stay with us?
If anyone has one, feel free to put it in. I'll also note that we'll have the slides for this on our website and the recordings. We'll link that, and then we'll also follow up with an email to attendees as well. I'm not seeing any other questions come in. I think I've addressed the main ones. Someone did ask, and maybe, I don't know if everyone could see that, if the patient copay will be based off of the WAC or the negotiated price. And I replied to that. I don't know if everyone could see that it would be off negotiated price. And otherwise, I think we're good. So we're right on the hour.
Okay. Well, a big, huge thank you to our panelists. We appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us, and to all of the attendees, same thing. Your time and expertise is worth so much, and we're glad you joined us today.
Yes, and join us next month. We'll be sending out information. The topic will be digital therapeutics and discussing all of the fun that comes along with those in terms of bringing them to market and coverage. Thank you all so much.
Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.